Hello class, welcome to Illustrator Lab 5. Today we're going to review and practice the shape tools, widgets, rotate and scale tools, Pathfinder tools, gradient tools, and effects within Adobe Illustrator. The file you'll need to have downloaded is gamecontroller.ai. When you have that, go ahead and open up that file. What you should have here is an artboard that has 3 blank spaces, and next to it we have a reference PNG of what we are going to recreate using those tools that I mentioned before. In your layers window, you should see that we have a layer for where we're going to illustrate. We have a layer that includes our color swatches, which are here off to the left. These are all the colors that we're going to use inside of our illustration. We also have a layer right here with some reference. All right, so the reference includes not only what we're kind of recreating, but the original photograph of the Nintendo Super Entertainment System controller that was used to base our illustration on. Go ahead and lock that layer. We won't need to necessarily move that around. And then we'll get started. So we're going to start from the top here. We're going to recreate this very first game controller. This one that kind of relies on solid fills and strokes. All right, after that we will move on to our second game controller, the one that has no stroke but has a lot of gradients, so it kind of feels a little more three-dimensional. And then finally we'll move on to this third option. It looks kind of like a neon sign. This one is entirely used with strokes and effects. All right, so let's go ahead and zoom in here. In order to create this, we're going to kind of divide this into pieces. All right, so we're going to create the body of the controller first, this big gray housing for all the electronics. And then we'll create our directional pad, our D-pad, our start select buttons, and then our button pad. Last, we'll come through here and create our cord, our power cord. To get started, let's actually... So in this illustration, we have all these swatches over here, the colors that we're going to use. I don't want to continually be scrolling over to find them and to use the eyedropper tool. So instead, what I'd like to do is we're going to, for the first time, we're going to use the swatches window. So if you don't have swatches in your little window set here on the right or on the left, go ahead and click on Window and collect it from the drop-down menu. Yours might be full of several default colors here. That's totally fine if it comes in like that. We're going to create some new swatches. First of all, this is how I'm going to do it. I'm just going to use my eyedropper. I'm going to load this color into my fill on my toolbar. You notice it also loaded into your fill in your swatches window. And then I'm going to click and drag that fill into my swatches window. All right, so that's my very first swatch that I've dragged in. All right, I'm going to do it again with each of these colors. This is going to make them just a little bit more accessible throughout the lecture instead of having to scroll around and find them. All right, so I've done all of my grays. I had 5 different grays from darkest to lightest. Now I'm going to start with my blues. I'm going to go darkest blue, middle blue, light blue. I'm going to go to my greens. Darkest green, middle green, light green. And again with the reds, darkest red, middle red, lightest red. Maybe you would call that pink. All right, yellows. Darkest yellow, middle yellow, lightest yellow. Lightest yellow is almost white. It's like an ivory. All right. I'm switching back to my selection tool. I no longer need to necessarily look at those. And now I'm going to come up here into the reference for my illustration. I'm going to go ahead and pull swatches down here into my little windows. I'm going to keep swatches open, but I need to make sure I'm on my illustration layer. Switch to that really quick. Okay. Within swatches, we know that the body of the controller is this fill. This not lightest gray, but really light gray. I'm going to start by thinking of the shapes that it will take to create this controller, the body. All right, so I can see right now I'm going to need 2 circles for my left and right hand, And then I'm going to need a way to connect them in the middle, which I'm going to use a rectangle. So let's start with our circle or ellipse tool, hotkey L. And I'm going to kind of center my cursor here in the center of the D-pad, because I know that that's the center of my circle. I'm going to hold down Option to make an ellipse from the center out. And then I'm going to hold down Shift to make sure that it's a perfect circle. All right. And by the time I get to the edge, I'm going to let go of my click before I let go of my keys. If I let go of my keys, then my constraining properties will disappear and it'll end up being a weird ellipse. All right, now I'm going to want just an exact duplicate of this one. I don't want to repeat. I don't want to make another circle because I might make it a different size. And I want this to feel very geometric and very manufactured. So I'm going to hold down Option and Shift and then duplicate that object. All right, so you should have two ellipses that are the exact same size. I used Option to duplicate the object. I used Shift so that I dragged it only horizontally. I didn't accidentally move it up or down at all. All right, so next we need a rectangle that is going to connect them. I'm going to hit my hotkey M for rectangle. And then I'm going to line up my cursor here with kind of the bottom of this plane. And I'm going to click and drag a rectangle that connects my two objects. Now, I don't want, a lot of you are going to think, oh, I'm going to drag it all the way up to the top. I don't want you to do that right now. There's a reason for that. So just go ahead and create a rectangle that just overlaps both of them, that lines up with the bottom of the plane. And then we're going to use our Pathfinder tool after selecting all three objects and uniting them. All right, so once they're united, I can now actually use my minus anchor point tool, so the minus key, and just subtract those two anchor points and get my nice perfect top. So instead of trying to guess of where to stop my rectangle, I don't have to. I can get a little bit ahead of that. All right, so that's our main controller body shape. Let's go ahead and move it off to the side here. We'll center it into our artboard here in a second. It looks like I probably have rounded out this corner a little bit, so it's not too terribly sharp. So let's go through on our controller body and grab those two smallest anchor points using our direct selection tool, that hotkey A, the white arrow. And then let's get a little gentle rounding to that bottom corner. Makes it a little bit more friendly to hold in your hand. All right, so this is the top plane of our controller. Our illustration kind of shows this side plane. Let's go ahead and duplicate this object down. So again, that's Shift and Option while moving it with your either direct selection tool or selection tool. We're going to change it to that next darker gray in our swatches. And then we're going to use our bracket keys, so Command and left bracket, to send it backwards in our layer 1 object. Perfect. All right. So I want this plane to continue straight up into my top plane, so I don't have this kind of funky double bump going on. So I'm going to use my pen tool actually really quick. I'm going to hover my cursor. Right now I have some smart guides turned on. You're welcome to turn those on so that it tells you when you are hovering over an anchor or creating a vertical or horizontal line. That is in your drop-down menu, View. So View and then Smart Guides. You don't need them. Most of you can eyeball this just fine. But I'm going to use my pen tool and holding down Shift so that I create a bunch of straight lines. Drawing that rectangle. And now if I send that back using my Command and left bracket key, it now kind of helps create that illusion of that plane dropping down vertically instead of curving inward. Once I've done that, I'm going to select both those two dark gray objects and unite them into a single object. All right, let's take a look at our illustration, what we need to do next. All right, next we need a stroke around our entire controller body. All right, I don't have an object that is that exact shape, so I'm going to have to make one. I'm going to select both my side plane and my top plane of my controller. I'm going to get a copy of those, Command C, but I'm going to paste them in front, Command F, and then use my Unite tool to create a single object. Now this one had a dark stroke, darker than either of those fills, so I'm going to go find that darker stroke color. And right now it's in my fill. In order to change a fill to a stroke, we can hit the hotkey Shift X, and it will swap what property is in our fill into our stroke and our stroke into our fill. And then I'm going to increase that stroke point using my control bar. I think 6 point seems pretty good. Maybe I'll pump it up just a little bit, 7 point. Now in this scenario, my stroke is straddling my path. Half of my stroke is on the outside and half of my stroke is on the inside. I want all of my stroke to be on the outside of my path right now. So I'm going to use my stroke window. If you don't have your stroke window, go ahead and collect it by clicking on window and then collecting it from that drop-down menu. Now in stroke, if I have a closed path, my aligned stroke option will be available to me. And right now you see it's highlighted where my stroke is centered on my path. I could also push my stroke to the inside, or like I said, I would like to push my stroke to the outside. Let's go ahead and look at more of what we need for the body. All right, I have two triggers here. I have a left trigger and a right trigger on the back of my controller body. I also have this fun little highlight, this little stroked highlight. This is really light gray that comes along the top here. So let's go ahead and create those. All right, to create the highlight, we need a piece of path from our top plane. I'm going to use my white arrow, my direct selection tool, hotkey A, to select these two anchor points. So click on one, hold down Shift, click on the other. And then I'm going to use that copy paste in front again, that Command C, Command F, to give myself just that piece of path. All right, so now what I have is, I'm going to give it that lighter color. Just from this anchor point to this anchor point, a light gray. Again, I need to change this to be within a stroke and not a fill, so I'm going to hit Shift X to swap those two properties and then add some width to it. All right, so currently this is behind my large path, my large dark outline. I'm going to bring it in front, so Command and right bracket. Now that's a little bit thicker than I want it to be. That's okay. I'm going to want this path to be entirely on the inside, the stroke to be on the inside of my path. So you'll notice that I can't use my align stroke to do that. That's because this is an open path. But what I can use is my width tool, Shift W. And well, if I hold down my Option key, I can go ahead and pull the outside of my path in and only have stroke on the inside. Once I've done this, if I take a look at my example, you notice that this has a rounded cap. So from my stroke window, I'm going to need to add a rounded cap. All right, let's go ahead and get those two trigger controllers now, trigger buttons. All right, again, I'm going to need a copy of this path. I can probably just select this path outright. So Control C, Control F. The stroke is going to need to be that really dark gray again. Now this time, I don't need the stroke to be on the inside at all. I can use my width tool. Actually, what I can do is ask for a uniform width. All right, so I've changed that to be a uniform width on my control bar. Now I'm going to add a lot of extra width because this exceeds my outer stroke. You see it kind of pumps out just a little bit of the edge. That's great. Now I just need a piece or a part of this, but I need a smaller piece or part than I have anchor points. So I'm going to use my plus key for my add anchor point, and I'm going to add an anchor point here along kind of the top ridge, and then just a smaller section of anchor point here as it comes horizontal along the top of that controller pad. Now I can select the anchor points that are unneeded and hit delete until I have just this segment of path. All right, I'm going to add just a little bit more width to mine. Looks like I want mine to be about 25 points. And then I'm going to send this all the way to the back. I don't want it to appear over the top of my highlight or my controller body. So I'm using command and left bracket to send it backward. Actually, that was a terrible idea because I need to create a copy of it first. So, excuse me. Now that I have the shape and size of the piece I want, I'm going to duplicate that using Option and Shift. And then I want to mirror this object. I want it to be facing left instead of right. All right, so there's a hotkey for mirror, and it's actually hotkey O. This is kind of a cousin to rotate and scale. You'll notice I always stick at the same little target appearing in the center. Now I want to mirror this horizontally, so I'm going to go ahead and click and drag horizontally. Now if I do that, I can also rotate my object at the same time. I don't want to rotate it, so I'm going to hold down Shift in order to make sure I don't rotate the object. And I can go ahead and move that path over the right side of my controller. Select both of my triggers, my left and right trigger, and move them backwards in my layer using command and left bracket. Fantastic. I think that gets us done for the controller body. So let's go ahead and select all those objects we have created and group them, Command G. If you're on a PC, that'll be Control G. All right, now let's go ahead and create our very first set of buttons, our D-pad. We're going to need to use our rectangle tool, our ellipse tool, and our shape tool to start. Let's begin by creating this outer ring, this kind of containing ellipse. So I'm going to put my cursor again in approximately the center of this little circle here and draw that ellipse holding on Shift and Option. I'm going to give it a stroke of that dark gray. I don't want it to have a fill right now because I want to be able to see through. So kind of that dark gray stroke, and we'll increase the width of that stroke until it somewhat matches our reference image. All right, now inside of that, I'm going to need another ellipse, but I need it to share the same center. So I'm going to hit Control C, Control F. Then I'm going to switch to my selection tool and reduce the size of this button and change it to the dark gray fill. So we should have two. We have an outer circle and an inner circle. This is the dark gray. And we'll move this off to the side here so you can see a little bit better what you're doing instead of trying to see directly on top of the D-pad. All right, so we're going to need two rectangles, a vertical rectangle and a horizontal rectangle. I'm going to create one and then duplicate it to create the other. So hotkey M for rectangle. I'm going to change my color to be correct there, so that fill color. All right, so I'm going to draw right now. It's not going to be perfectly centered, but I will center it in a minute. I'm going to draw my first rectangle, and I'm going to use my widgets here that appear in the corner to round out those outer edges. Oh, actually, it looks like our inner edges here are going to be rounded, so we don't need it. We're not going to do that yet. Just kidding. Command Z. All right, so let's duplicate this. Command C, Command F. We're going to use R for rotate. And then as we rotate it, we're going to hold down Shift to make sure that it rotates only horizontally and vertically. I don't, you know what, really quick, I don't love that I made that a little bit short, so I'm going to make that a little bit longer. Okay, Command C, Command F, R, hold down Shift for rotate. All right, so now I have my two rectangles. I'm going to use my Unite Pathfinder tool to create one object. And now if I switch to hotkey A, I should have widgets, and I'm going to pull those in ever so gently to kind of soften that edge of that button. All right, I'm going to send them behind my central circle that I created because I want this to be in the correct order. I'm going to give that a a fill now, Shift X. And I would like now for all of my objects to share the same vertical and horizontal center. This is where we're going to start using a tool called Align. All right, it is a cousin to transform in Pathfinder when you bring those shape or those windows into your program. It'll also appear on your control bar if you have more than 2 objects selected. So if I select 3 objects, up here I now have some options of how to align those. I can align them all to have the same left side, the same right side, but right now what I really actually need is for them to all have the same vertical center and the same horizontal center. All right, so that'll keep them all nice and mathematically lined up. Now we're going to use our shape tool because we need a triangle. So I'm going to go ahead and get my shape tool from my drop-down menu, my polygon tool. And remember, if I click and drag, I get a hexagon by default. I'm going to go ahead and hit my down arrow until I have a triangle, only 3 sides. And then I'll hold down Shift so that my triangle is vertically oriented, nice and straight upright. I will drag that triangle down onto my D-pad, maybe resize it just a little bit. And then use the widgets by switching the hotkey A to round out the corners. And so you can fuss a little bit with how you want it laid out, how you want it to appear inside of your button. I'm going to duplicate that object, holding Shift and Option, or Shift and Alt. I'm going to rotate my object. I'm going to hold down Shift as I rotate it so that I rotate it a nice 180 degrees. I'm going to move it a little bit just by eye to get a nice distance into my D-pad. Now I'm going to select both of these triangles, and I'm going to, right now I'm going to make sure that they are vertically aligned together, and then I'm going to group them, Command G or Control G. Now I want them to share the same center alignment with my circle. All right, I'm going to pretend that I made them a little bit crooked so I can kind of make my point a little bit stronger here. So let's say I made my triangles out here to the left, but I want them to be aligned with my circle. Right now, if I select that group and my circle, my ellipse, and I hit this vertical alignment, it's going to move both sets of objects towards their common center. And I don't want that because this already has the common center with 2 other objects. So I don't want to be messing around. So if I want to move this set of objects, this group, to have a center with my circle, once they're selected, if I click one more time without holding down any keys on my ellipse, I have now created kind of an anchoring or a key object. Now when I use my Align tool, that object is not allowed to move. It is kind of locked there. Now that I have this set of objects, I'm going to hit Command C, Command F for a copy. I'm going to hit R for rotate, and my rotate center will be in the center of that ellipse. And then I'm going to rotate that copy to get my left and right arrows. Now this does mean that I have 2 inner circles because I copied that as well. That's fine. Now we can delete that copy. All right, so that is my D-pad. I'm going to hit Command G, group those objects, or Control G if you are on a PC. Now let's go ahead and line that up inside our controller. You're going to have to make sure it looks like you have a nice good center. If you need to create another object, another ellipse to center that more properly, go for it. Now I think one thing I'm missing is I think my D-pad had a stroke, so I'm going to do that real quick. That did look kind of funky. I have to select it either using my direct selection tool or my group selection tool. I have programmed a hotkey for my group selection tool. And that object needs to have a stroke. All right, so now let's go ahead, let's just move left to right. Let's go ahead and create these pieces of our controller. We have a start and select. We also have this which would usually host a logo area. So I'm going to create a rectangle. Let's go ahead and use that middle gray stroke. So I'm going to use a rectangle tool. I'm going to make it as long and wide as that little panel, and then use my widgets to pull in the corners, to round the corners. I'm going to increase the weight of that stroke. So I should have created that nice little shape right there. Now when it comes to the start and select buttons, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to use our rectangle tool. Let's use the darkest fill color. And I can't create a rectangle at a 45-degree angle. I have to create it vertically or horizontally. So let's go ahead and create a vertical one really quick. We'll rotate it in a moment. Use our widgets to round out those corners. Now R for rotate, Shift to constrain that rotation to 45 degrees. And then this has a fun little inner highlight. So I'm going to need a copy of my object. Command C, Command F. I will change it to have that stroke color, but no fill. Slightly lighter gray. And then I'm going to use my selection tool and my option key to reduce the size of that inner rectangle. Once I have that inner rectangle reduced, I'm going to create that stroke just a little bit larger. I maybe need to adjust my width a little bit. And then what's left is we need to delete the piece of path that we don't need, so these bottom two anchor points. And then using our stroke window, which you may have opened from the last time we used it, give them a round cap. So we get that kind of fun candy cane shepherd's crook shape for the highlight on our start and select buttons. Once we've created one, we're just going to select that object, Command G, and then we are going to duplicate it. So let's see, I'll place it over the template, and then I'll duplicate it. And once I have those two, I'm going to group those two together, Command G. Now those and our previous rectangle need to make it onto our illustration, so let's bring those over here. And then we'll create our button pad. All right, so our button pad. Let's go ahead and start with our background ellipse. So I'm going to place my cursor in what I believe is generally the center of this ellipse. I'm going to hit down. I'm going to hold down Shift and Option while I create it. Now, once I create it, I realize I created a little left or a little right. I can nudge it with my arrow keys. All right, so this needs to have a dark gray stroke and a middle gray fill. That stroke should probably be a little bit more than a 1 point. Be 4 points, that looks a little better. All right, now I have two rectangles. They look just like my select buttons, just a different fill and stroke inside my button panel ellipse. So let's, using hotkey M, create one that I think is about the right width and height. I'm going to fill it with that lighter gray. I'm going to reduce the size of that stroke once. Everybody's going to be slightly different. That's all right. I'm going to hit R for rotate, and then hold down Shift. I'll make sure that my rotation is only 45 degrees. Now, once I have this rotated, I'm going to go ahead and it looks like I need to make it just a little bit larger before I use my widgets to round out the tops, the bottom, the corners. All right, now again, kind of we made one of our start select buttons and then we duplicated because it was the exact same. We're going to kind of do that with our button pads right now. Let's go ahead and use our ellipse tool. And we're going to create a red and a yellow button. And then we will create our blue and our green. So using L for ellipse, we're going to create an ellipse inside of our little housing rectangle here. And it needs to have a medium red fill and a dark red stroke. The stroke needs to be not quite as thick. And then it has a small highlight along the top here. So I want you to hit Command C, Command F, make a slightly smaller version of that ellipse. We're going to delete this bottom anchor point. So we're going to have, we'll rotate it here in a second. So if you're thinking this is wrong, you're right. We're going to fix it though. So we're going to have a piece of path up here. We don't need it to have any fill, but its stroke color, if we go down here to swatch, it needs to be that pink. And we're going to add that round cap. It looks like I need to make it just a little bit chunkier. All right, now that I have both my pieces, I'm going to select the highlight of my button and the body of my button. And I'm going to use R for rotate to rotate them both 45 degrees at the same time. 45 degrees is happening because I'm holding down Shift. Now I'm going to duplicate that button. And we will create our yellow. And we'll just, all we need to do now is switch the colors of our strokes and fills using our swatches. All right, so now let's select this button, and that housing rectangle, and we'll move them onto our template. And we know the top one's gonna have to be blue, and the bottom one's gonna have to be green, so we'll duplicate that group now. And then we will edit this button to have our middle blue fill, dark blue stroke, light blue highlight, and then our green, our middle green fill, dark green stroke, and light green highlight. And then we can group that set of objects together, Command G, and move them onto our button pad ellipse. And then we'll group everything together, Command G. And move that onto our illustration. That does reveal that I haven't centered that very well. There we go. Okay, last part of our controller is this cord where it plugs into the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, some of you might be tempted to try to use your pen tool, hotkey P, to try to draw out these curves. We're actually going to draw a bunch of straight lines and then use our widgets. So let's actually use this as a guide. If I click once here where I know the controller and the cord connect, and I'm going to hold down Shift to keep a nice vertical line. I'm going to hold down Shift again to keep a nice horizontal line. Shift for a nice vertical, and Shift for another horizontal. Once I have this path created, I can select this upper anchor point with hotkey A and round that out, around that corner with my widgets. And then select my two far right anchor points and using hotkey A, round out the corners using my widgets. So I have a much more mathematical, geometric shaped cord. Now this is the darkest color stroke, the darkest gray that we had in those swatches. So I'm going to change that color and increase my stroke width to, looks like maybe 8 or 9. All right, so that's a look at the object we're creating. It's kind of hard to see right on top of the template. And next we're going to create the area that plugs into the system. All right, so we're going to need just a bunch of rectangles. All right, so our first rectangle is going to be that lightest gray. Oops, except for it's not going to be stroke, it's going to be fill. So a light gray rectangle. And then its partner is going to be a duplicate. So we're going to hold an Option and Shift and duplicate that object and make it the slightly darker gray. We need it to be in the fill, not the stroke. And then we'll send it backwards in the layer using Command left bracket. So we should have two rectangles, one on top of the other. All right, next we're going to create the main body here. So rectangle tool. And we're going to have to round out this far right set of corners. Let's go ahead and give that the correct fill color. Select both our far right anchor points, and then using hotkey A or direct selection tool, round out the corners with widgets. And then it has a partner too, a slightly darker version that we're going to drag using Option and Shift. Give it a slightly darker fill, and then send it backward in the layer. All right, so we've got those two pieces now. I'll scoop these up to the side a little bit more. So 4 rectangles. We're going to need 2 rectangles here to be kind of that textural component, that little thumb pad, the plug. This one is going to need to be stroke, so I'm going to hit Shift X to change my fill for my stroke. Increase the weight of the stroke. And then I've got a second one here that's actually a fill. It's a rectangle with completely rounded corners. And I'll place that on my controller plug. I'm going to decrease that width a little bit. And then one last rectangle here. With its far right anchor points rounded with widgets. So that's all the parts that I need for that plug. Once I have those created, you'll notice we also have a stroke around those, kind of like we had a big stroke around the controller body. So I'm going to select all these objects. I'm going to hit Command C, Command F, or Control C, Control F on a PC. And then my Pathfinder tool, I'm going to use Unite to get one single object. I need that to have a that darkest gray stroke. Increase that. Again, this darkest gray stroke needs to be on the outside of the object, so we're going to use that Align Stroke option to push it to the outside. Now, along with it being on the outside, I also want it to have rounded corners. So we've used rounded caps before, but I want it to have nice round corners in my illustration. I'm going to place that back over the template and collect that and the chord that I drew. I need to group those. Command G or Control G. And then we will drag those sets of objects over into our illustration. Now that I have all the pieces, I'm going to drag my illustration into the center of my artboard. And I'm going to make sure my cord doesn't interrupt. You see up here my cord is in front of my controller body. I'm going to send that all the way to the back by holding down Command and Shift and then tap my left bracket once. That'll send it to the back of the layer. And now I have a completed first version of our object. So I'm going to hit Command G and group that object together. All right, next, we have a version of this controller that doesn't have stroke, but it has a number of gradients inside of it. All right, so let's go ahead and duplicate this entire group of objects into the next space below. Now we're going to have to create 3 different gradients that we're going to use, and let's go ahead and make those now so we have a swatch for them. So our first gradient, you're going to need your gradient window. Remember to get that from your Windows drop-down menu. It is going to go from our lightest gray. I'm going to drag that lightest gray into my gradient window. Make sure I have 100% opacity. And, oops, our next lightest gray. Let's see if I can drag that up into from the swatches into my gradient. So we have a really light gradient. All right, lightest gray to next lightest gray. Once I have that gradient, I'm going to drag that swatch down into my swatches window. So this is my first gradient, my lightest gradient. The next gradient I need to create is from our 2 middle tones. All right, so I'm going to drag now my darker. So I have this middle tone already kind of in there, so I need to drag my darker swatch into my gradient and get rid of my lightest swatch. And I'm going to grab that gradient and put it in my swatches. So I have a light gradient, a middle gradient, and then we're going to create a dark gradient. So a gradient that includes our 2 darkest colors. If we're missing one, we'll go and make it later. Always a chance we're missing one. That's all right. Actually, a pretty good chance we're missing one. Let's make another one that has these 2 gradients in it, or these 2 swatches in it. In case I've messed up. All right, so we have 4 gradients, lightest to darkest. We're also going to need gradients between our middle and dark green, our middle and dark blue, middle and dark red, and middle and dark yellow. But since each one we only use once, we're not going to create a swatch for them. We'll just make those as we get there. All right, so let's come over to our controller. And first of all, let's start by deleting this piece of stroke here. That's on our main body. We're also going to use hotkey. So we're using hotkey A, our dark selection tool, to select pieces and parts that we know we're going to not need. So these little pieces of stroke, the little highlights that we put on our buttons and our object. All right, I think that's all the instances of highlight stroke that we need to get rid of. We'll need to get rid of this outsidemost stroke of our controller and the outsidemost stroke on our plug. Looks like I need to extend my cord just a little bit. Okay. So our first gradient for the controller pad is generally this middle gradient here. So I'm going to click on that gradient swatch now that I have it created. And I need to change the direction of my gradient to be lightest on top and darkest on bottom. So I'm using that G gradient tool to click and drag the direction of my gradient on my object. All right, now the side plane, I guess I need to ungroup this if I want to click on anything. The side plane of my controller body is our very darkest, oops, I had the wrong one selected, is our very darkest gradient. All right, with my darkest piece at the top and my middle a middle dark gray at the bottom. Now if we take a look, our D-pad ellipse is our lightest gradient, so I'm going to select that object and change it to my lightest gradient. We don't need stroke on it, not anymore. And then that gradient goes from darkest at the top to lightest at the bottom. So I've inverted that. Hold down Shift as you drag your gradient tool. That'll keep that vertically aligned. All right, now I have a middle gradient here. Again, this is this gradient for this this ellipse behind your button pad. It's actually the same gradient as the body, just inverted. So we're going to come over here. I'll have to get rid of stroke and fill it with that same gradient and invert it so that the light is on the bottom and the dark is at the top. Now our two housing rectangles for our buttons are our lighter gradient, the same one that was behind our D-pad. So we can actually use eyedropper for that. And then use our gradient tool to make sure they go from, darkest on top to lightest on bottom. Now this object here, where we would normally see the logo, is the same gradient as the controller body. So we use I for eyedropper, collect it from the gray body. Now we're just going to make sure it is a little bit darker on top and a little bit lighter on bottom, like in our example here. Actually looks like it's mostly the light, so I can move my gradient up over the top of it like that. Our two select and start buttons are our darkest gradient, and they are lightest on top and darkest on bottom. So mine came in at a good default, lightest on top, darkest on bottom. But I'm going to go ahead and control that a little more specifically. All right, let's see. I'm going at this a little bit randomly. I'm just checking my controller, coming into my illustration and one at a time looking at my gradient. So this is the same gradient as my controller body. Now it looks like I should probably get into my buttons now. Let's go into our buttons. I'm going to select all. Actually, I'm going to let's do this one at a time. So in my gradient, I can go ahead and first get rid of my stroke. But then in my gradient, I can select or pull in my middle gray and, my middle green and my dark green. And then for my blue, after getting rid of the stroke, pulling in my middle blue and my dark blue. Again, we're going to do it for yellow. No stroke. Middle yellow. Drag up the swatch for the dark yellow. And last but not least, red. Middle red. And dark red. Now each of these gradients have different colors in them, but they all have the same left to right linear orientation. So I'm actually going to select all of those. And oh, it's not going to let me edit all of them at the same time. I lied. We're going to change each one of these to, it's like negative 90 degrees, so our light is on top. Negative 90. Alright, so I'll orient all of our gradients correctly. Now, my two trigger buttons, they don't have a gradient necessarily. They are a slightly lighter color, so we'll have to change that lighter color. And it looks like I need to kind of reduce the size of them. Now that they're not trying to peek out over an additional stroke, they're looking a little bit large. So I'm going to use hotkey V to click and drag. Hold down Shift and click and drag. Let's see if I can select these without ungrouping everything. I might just have to ungroup everything. That's fine. There we go. So I've selected my two triggers. I'm going to reduce their size. And then I'm going to give them a different stroke color to match my template. And then we'll go into here and we'll add the gradients into the pieces of that controller plug. So we have our lightest gradient here. Oops, I put that in my stroke. Did you see that? You'll do that too sometimes. Dark on top. And our middle gradient. For both of those objects. And then for that texture, it's the same gradient on top of itself, so it's very subtle. Let's go ahead and select both those objects. You can either ungroup things to start selecting them again, or you can program in a group selection tool. That's what I've been hitting Shift A all this time for. Looks like our gradient here below is our nice heavy dark gradient. And for a final rectangle, the same gradient as this main body, just reversed in direction. Center that just a little nicer. Okay, now you'll notice there's two more things about this illustration that we haven't necessarily accomplished yet. The first is that you'll see that this chord actually has a gradient in it as well. And the next is that we have a nice gentle drop shadow below, which kind of helps its like little 3D nature in this illustration. So let's go ahead and find out ways to do both of those. I'm going to select this stroked object, and I'm going to give it my darkest gradient. All right, so with stroke forward, we're going to put gradient in the stroke. And now inside of my gradient window, I have some options for how this stroke is going to act inside of my stroke. Right now, it's just going from left to right. In this one, it will change as it makes corners. I want to select this third option here. And if we look inside of your stroke, we will see that it's going from the outside of the stroke to the inside of the stroke, darkest to lightest. I need the inside to be really light, so more near the actual path. And then we're going to need a third slider. So we're going to use Option to create a third slider so that it is dark again by the time the stroke gets to the far side of that path. So it goes dark, light, dark. And that's how we get a nice gradient inside of our stroke that makes it feel like a 3D cylindrical or tubular chord. All right, so that's the first time we've used gradient in stroke. unless you've done it like me a moment ago by accident. I'm going to zoom out here for a second. All right, now let's add that fun glowing effect to our object. So I'm going to use Hotkey V to select my entire group. Command G. And then let's go ahead and go into our effect drop-down menu. We're going to go to stylize. So we've done a lot of warp effects, but we haven't really done a lot of stylize. This is where we're going to find things like drop shadow, drop shadow, feather, inner glow, outer glow, red corners, etc. Let's go to drop shadow. And it's going to give us a default drop shadow that's going to be a little bit too dark. It's black color set to a multiply blending mode. We can keep these two properties, but I don't want the opacity to be 75. Let's try 25 and click our preview button. That's quite a bit softer, a little bit more like our template shows, so we'll keep that one. All right, we've finished controller number 2. Let's go ahead and let's learn how to create kind of this neon effect with controller number 3. We're going to duplicate controller number 2 down into the space. Now this is not going to need that effect that we just applied to the entire group. In fact, it's going to need an entirely different effect. So I want you to find your appearance window. All right, and if you don't have your appearance window, you can get it through your drop-down menu, window, and appearance. And then I want you to delete this drop shadow by highlighting it in your appearance window on your group and the trash can, because otherwise we're going to have some problems. Okay, now we're going to have to do some deletion. So earlier we had to delete a bunch of stroke to make the second controller. This time we're going to have to delete some inside paths. So the first thing we're going to do, I'll put this appearance back in here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to convert every one of these objects into an outline. So even things that are stroke, like right now, like our chord and our left and right triggers, we need to convert those into objects. So we're going to come up here to Object, Path, and Outline Stroke. We don't want anything to be a stroke. Oh dear, looks like I shouldn't have done that to this one. It's got a gradient mesh in it now. It's actually, if you followed along with me, go ahead and give a solid stroke to that chord first. Otherwise, you're going to have a little bit of a mess. Okay, now we'll do it again. Object, Path. Nope, I lied one more time. Pardon me. I'm all over the place. All right, I want to select the entire object except the chord. Don't select the chord. So everything but the chord. Now we're going to Object, Path, Outline, Stroke. I don't want to cause you a whole lot of problems later. All right. Now that all of our objects, nothing else is stroke right now. Everything is its own outside of an object with a fill. We're going to convert all of these to be an object with a stroke with no fill. Now the stroke color is going to be that light blue, that lightest highlight blue. And I'm going to also make sure my chord is that light blue. All right. Now we have some places that need to be cleaned up because we don't see path crossing into itself here. All right, so this is a job for our direct selection tool, that white arrow key, hotkey A. We're going to select pieces and parts that we don't want to see crossing back behind and hit delete on those anchor points. All right, so that takes care of the back of the controller. I want to also take care of the back side of these triggers. So I'm selecting anchor points and hitting my delete key to remove those. Looks like I need to maybe add a little bit of path there instead of deleting the whole thing. And I don't want this little overlap, so my chord coming in there. I'm going to move that, hotkey A. And I want to move this, but I don't want to change the curve. So I'm going to add an anchor point where I need it to stop and subtract the anchor point that's cutting in. So that was the plus key for add, minus key for subtract. Okay, so these are all the paths that I need to create this third version. Now, I started out with that lightest blue, but we're going to need this to be even brighter, even more neon. So I'm going to go to my color selector. I'm going to drop down here into that more cyan color and get the most saturated version of that color as I can before hitting OK. So all of my strokes should be that really saturated cyan. I'm going to increase my stroke width to 4 points. Yeah, 4 points is fine. And then I'm going to add an outer glow effect. So we used the drop shadow effect earlier on our controller number 2. But I would like to add an outer glow effect here. So I'm going to come up to Effect, Stylize, Outer Glow. And in this menu, I'm going to use a somewhat deeper blue. So not a cyan blue. I don't want it to glow the same color. I want it to glow a little bit deeper blue. And its blending mode is going to be normal. You know, so starting to preview that because my preview box is selected. So it's a little hint of this kind of nice dark blue or on the edges of that stroke. And you know, I'm okay with the 75% opacity and I'm okay with the 5 pixel blur, so I'm gonna hit OK. All right, now to get that super inner glow, here you'll actually notice that we have 2 strokes. So we have the cyan stroke and then we have a copy of it, the white. So let's go ahead and duplicate this group of objects. Control C, Control F. Oops, except I have to have it selected for that to happen. Control C, Control F. Now I'm going to change my stroke color to white. My stroke width down to maybe 1 or 2 points. Maybe I'll do 1.5. And this also has that blue outer glow effect to it. So we're almost done. What's left is to add a kind of gradient glow here behind the entire controller. So we're going to use an ellipse L. We're going to create a nice big ellipse behind the controller. Right now we're going to make it over the top of it. We'll move it behind in a second. And then in our gradient window, we're going to create a nice blue gradient using both of our middle blues. Looks like I'm doing it in my stroke instead of my fill. And our slider, one needs to be a 0% opaque slider, one needs to be a 50% opaque slider. And instead of a linear gradient, which is the default, we're going to make a radial gradient. This radial gradient has my transparent slider on the inside. I'm going to make sure that that is reversed using this reverse gradient button. And then using now my gradient tool, hotkey G, I'm going to pull this gradient inside that ellipse so we don't see an edge of it anywhere. Now this ellipse needs to be a little bit larger. I was a little bit too conservative with that. And then I need to place it behind my controller in the layer. So I'm going to use Command and Shift again, and then my left bracket tool to send it all the way to the back. You know, I think my white stroke group is just, I think 1.5 was too much. I think I'm going to go down to 1. I want to see more of that cyan behind it. All right, that is it. You did it. All right, so this is 3 ways you can use different treatments of stroke or gradient or fill to create the same object but in very different visual ways. I really hope that you felt like you got a lot of practice in with those tools that we covered previously, and that you feel kind of more equipped to draw things that are maybe more um, manufactured in nature, that you're excited about your next project. Um, Again, if you have any questions, please always reach out. And thank you for sticking with it today. Go ahead and make sure you save your file, and submit it on time. All right. Have a great day.